Welcome to Asian Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Our show today, Tsai Ing-Wen visits Washington and the recent Shangri dialogue. To discuss both topics is Bonnie Glaser, joining us via Skype from Washington, D.C. Ms. Glaser is Senior Advisor for Asia in the Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and also Senior Associate, CSIS Pacific Forum. Bonnie, it's great to have you back with us on Asia in Review.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
You're quite welcome. Well, let's talk about the Shangri-La dialogue first. Some of our audience might not be familiar with the Shangri-La dialogue. I wonder if you could just give them a brief explanation of what the dialogue seeks to accomplish, how often it meets, who attends it, that sort of thing.
Well, the Shangri-La dialogue meets once a year, usually at the very end of May or early June. And this is a meeting that was established and is still run by the Institute for International Strategic Studies in London. And it brings together defense ministers from around the region, in fact, from around the world. This year, I think they had about 18 senior defense representatives. And then at the same time, there's a track 2 discussion. So scholars that come, there's a lot of networking. The plenary sessions are public, and then there are special breakout sessions, which are on the record. And then in addition to that, these defense representatives meet separately behind closed doors. So it gives officials the opportunity to sit down and meet with counterparts from other countries. So, for example, the Defense Secretary from the United States might have a handful of bilaterals with counterparts from key countries. He might also have a trilateral. The last few years, there's been trilaterals with the United States, Japan, and Australia, and United States, Japan, and Korea. Of course, there are bilaterals between the Chinese and the Russians, or the Vietnamese and the Chinese. So then there's a lot of media activity as well. So the discussion really focuses on security in the Asia Pacific, and that means non-traditional security issues, terrorism threats, and also, of course, issues pertaining to maritime problems and challenges such as the East China Sea and the South China Sea. And indeed, this year, also last year, the South China Sea was a very prominent topic at the Shangri-La dialogue.
How many people would you say altogether attended this year's Shangri-La dialogue?
Well, there's a large number of delegates that I would guess, and this is really off the top of my head, that there's probably about 300, maybe more, delegates that are official delegates. Then there are other people who are news media, and then there are the defense officials and their delegations. And you can imagine that these defense entourages can be very big.
Very big, yeah.
Our Pacific commander, who of course was just sworn in, Admiral Harry Harris, had his entourage from the Pacific Command, and then of course there was a separate group that came from the Defense Department along with Secretary Ash Carter, and every country has a large number of people who carry the bags, do the staff work for their defense representative. So overall, it's in the thousands.
Speaking of Admiral Harris, he's going to be on Asia in Review probably sometime in August, so we're looking forward to that. Well, you wrote a very interesting op-ed piece in the form of a PACnet, a publication put out by our friends at Pacific Forum. I think that originally was written in the form of a CSIS Asian Maritime Security Initiative, which then was published again as a PACnet. And I like the title. It was a very catching title, China's Missed Opportunity at the Shangri-La Dialogue. I think our audience probably would like to hear what that was all about.
Well, I think that there is growing concern in the region about Chinese activity in the South China Sea. This year, more than any other prior Shangri-La dialogue, there was concern expressed by many of the defense officials. Even we heard from Malaysia concern about the South China Sea, from the European representative, Federica Mogherini, who is the High Commissioner of the EU for foreign policy issues, from the UK, from the Germans, Australians, from everyone. And so this is not just an issue between the United States and China. There is growing concern about China's land reclamation activity, about possible challenges to freedom of navigation, about the potential use of force in the region, continuing use of coercion by China against its smaller neighbors. And so China really does have an opportunity, I think, to explain its policy and to engage with the region. Every year, China sends a different representative. I don't think actually that's done deliberately. I think it's just a question of the person who has the job of the foreign policy portfolio in the PLA. And China has only once sent its defense minister to the Shangri-La dialogue. That was in 2011. And so this year it sent a deputy chief of the general staff. This year it was a 3-star, last year it was 2 stars, so a bit of a step up. But most of these PLA officers have very limited exposure to international affairs and to foreigners. And they get up in front of this very large audience and they read their speech. And I think when the Q&A comes, none of the Chinese who speak at this meeting wants to make a mistake. It's a big problem if they say something that incorrectly represents Chinese policy, and then there is a criticism of that individual domestically. So this year, Admiral Sun Jianguo read his speech, and then it came to the Q&A, and there were about probably 10 or 12 questions that were collected for him. And the head of the IISS gave him 10 minutes and said, you can answer the questions that you would like to, but we'll give you 10 minutes. He spent the first minute or two saying that he got too many questions, and he apologized for taking so long in his speech because he didn't leave enough time, to answer the questions. And then he proceeded to look in what was clearly a prepared briefing book that he had in front of him. So, for example, there was a question posed to him about North Korea's recent alleged sea-launched ballistic missile, SLBM launch at sea. And so he turned the pages and he found the tab that said Korea, and then he looked at that page and he said something like, China supports peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. We want to see denuclearization. In other words, there was no connection between the answer to the question and the question itself. And he did the same thing for cyber issues. So there was no attempt to engage with the audience. And even if he had simply stated in general terms Chinese policy, if he had appeared to be responding to the questions, I think that people who were attending the Shangri-La dialogue would have had a little bit of sympathy for him. I mean, this is a tough job for any Chinese general. But I think the fact that he just simply read pre-prepared answers that had nothing to do with the questions, I think made people very frustrated.
Did he speak English, or did he need a translator?
At the Shangri-La dialogue, there are translators for several languages. They usually have Chinese, Japanese, and English. If there is a representative who speaks in Russian, then they will translate from that language. So there's always a translator. And I don't know whether he speaks English at all, but he certainly conversed in Chinese and was wearing a headset listening to simultaneous translation.
I see. It's interesting that you mentioned that several European powers, I think you mentioned Germany, for example, are quite interested in the South China Sea. I think we tend to think this is only an Asian concern, but it's actually, it goes beyond just Asia.
Well, I think you can look at the statement, the leader's statement that just came out of the G7 meeting in the last 24 hours. You will see a long paragraph on the maritime concerns that are shared by the G7 countries, which of course include the United States, Japan, and many European countries. And they express concerns specifically about the South China Sea, about coercion, about the need for a rules-based system, for differences in territorial disputes to be handled according to the Convention on the Law of the Sea. So this is quite a detailed statement, and I think does reflect the growing concern among European countries.
It seems that Chinese actions in the South China Sea are actually having a counter effect to what China would like to achieve. It seems to me that they're pushing claimants closer to the United States, which seems to me to be opposite of what China wants.
Well, I think that China has conflicting interests in dealing with the South China Sea. On the one hand, yes, their objective is to have good relations with their neighbors and to try and address these disputes peacefully, bilaterally, but not in any way harm China's interests in the process. The problem is that the other objective has been very clearly articulated by Xi Jinping. And this really started very early in his tenure, even before he became president of the PRC, after he was appointed general secretary of the party. He really laid out this line that China must maintain its territorial integrity and sovereignty, that it can never make concessions on territorial issues, and that it cannot swallow the bitter fruit of foreign insistence, pressure on China. So this is really a position that I think is very difficult to really square this circle. I think observers see this, at least I do, as contradictory. However, I think in Xi Jinping's mind, they're actually connected and they're two sides of the same coin. It's interesting, however, if you look back at how China managed its territorial disputes with its land neighbors, China has 14 neighbors that border its periphery on its land. And there's 12 agreements that the Chinese essentially reached settling these disputes in years past. And at the time that the Chinese negotiated these agreements, they had a very different principle. The principle was mutual understanding and mutual concessions. Nowadays, the Chinese don't talk about making concessions. They insist it's all theirs, and countries of the region must respect China, must defer to China's interests, because China's the bigger power. And so I think that the Chinese are willing to withstand a degree of tension with these other claimants because they're playing the long game. They expect over time that all of these countries will prefer to benefit from China's economic largesse, to have good relations with China because China's the big bully in the region, and not insist on these territorial issues that they currently have now with China. So we see China now having tension with Vietnam, with the Philippines, with Malaysia, even to some extent with Indonesia, which is not a formal claimant in the South China Sea. So then there's, of course, other countries like Singapore, who are concerned about what is transpiring in the South China Sea, and countries outside the region. Japan and Australia have spoken out recently about China's land reclamation activity. So China has tensions with all of these neighbors, at the same time. And I think the U.S. strategy is that as these countries' concerns rise, as they cooperate more calculus, the Chinese see the cost was greater than the benefits and will revise its strategy.
Okay, we're going to take a break here. We'll be right back. You're watching Asian Review. Our guest today is Bonnie Glaser, who's joining us via Skype from Washington, D.C. We've been talking about the Shangri-La dialogue, and of course that leads us into a discussion of the South China Sea. When we come back, a couple more questions in this segment, and then we're going to go on and talk about Tsai Ing-Wen's historic visit to Washington, D.C. So don't go away. We'll be right back.
Hi, Jay.
Hi, Keith.
My name's Keith Bettinger.
I knew that.
And I'm the host of ThinkTech Asia.
I knew that too.
Here on ThinkTech.
Fabulous. You got a great show going, Keith.
Thank you very much. And for our viewers out there that are interested in ThinkTech Asia, it airs every Tuesday from 4 to 4:45, and it can be accessed online at thinktech.com.
Yeah, so what kind of guests you like?
Well, we have a number of guests from academia, from practitioners of international affairs. Sometimes we have military officials. Sometimes we have public officials on the show. And our goal, we try to talk about current issues in South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Central Asia, all throughout the Asian realm in more depth than you would find in traditional mainstream
That's the
media.
difference, isn't it?
Exactly.
That you're reaching out beyond what ordinary news media would do.
Right.
That's why we like you so much.
We're trying to provide a thinking person's perspective, an intelligent perspective on what's going on, and we're both sides of the story, or even when there's more than two sides, we try to cover every angle. And I think that's one of the big benefits that we provide here at ThinkTech. Is it's a really innovative source of educational programming for the people of Hawaii.
You're great, Keith. You are a great host. You got a great show going on. I watch it every week.
Thanks very much.
Why don't you guys watch it every week too, okay?
4:45 to 4 to 4:45 every Tuesday.
Welcome back to Asian Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. My guest today is Bonnie Glaser. Bonnie works at the Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington, D.C., the preeminent think tank in Washington, D.C., by the way. She is a specialist in Chinese and Taiwanese affairs. We have been talking about the Shangri-La dialogue, and we have one question remaining in this segment, and then we're going to go on to the really interesting visit of Tsai Ing-Wen to Washington last week. Bonnie, what's your take on mill-to-mill relations? Are they, how should I put the question more clearly, are they achieving very much? Have they achieved anything significant?
Well, I assume you mean mill-mill relations between the U.S. and China.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
We can talk about mill-mill relations between lots of countries. I think that there has been significant progress in the U.S.-China mill-mill relationship. In 1998, the United States established what was called the Military Maritime Consultative Agreement, MMCA, with China. The idea was to simply create a mechanism within which the two sides would start talking about how to prevent accidents at sea and in the air, really operational safety. And of course, 3 years later, 2001, the U.S. and China had a collision between a Chinese fighter and an American surveillance plane in which a Chinese pilot died. Many people thought at the time that would really inject some urgency into this dialogue about operational safety. But it didn't. The Chinese really refused to engage. It wasn't until Xi Jinping came to power that China has really taken seriously the need to avoid accidents at sea and in the air. And we really do have to credit Xi Jinping. He came to the United States when he was vice president. He went over to the Pentagon. I think he had some pretty serious discussions about the dangers of operating in close proximity around China's borders, and how both sides really don't want to end up in an incident that could escalate out of control. And so what we've seen now at the end of last year, two memoranda of understanding, MOUs, were signed. And one is communication mechanisms that operators of naval ships use, the frequencies that they will use, how they will position their ships so that they do not end up in an accident, a collision of any kind. These are all based on international operational procedures. They are not newly created between the U.S. and China. So the Code of Unplanned Encounters at Sea, CUES, is really the basis for this agreement. And this year, the Chinese and the U.S. have committed to conclude another agreement on air-to-air encounters. So there will be even more operational safety mechanisms put in place. Now, whether these are actually used in a crisis will be a challenge going ahead. But we're seeing that as U.S. and Chinese ships encounter each other, they are exercising, using, implementing these new understandings. And I think that's important.
Oh, that's interesting. Because sometimes people say, well, China is really getting the best of the mill-to-mill relations. Having an opportunity to more closely see how the U.S. operates, and the U.S. doesn't seem to enjoy a reciprocal benefit according to that school of thought.
Well, I think certainly is some benefit that the Chinese receive when they are able to tour U.S. ships or aircraft. And as we speak, the vice chairman of the CNC is arriving in the United States. He's spending 3 days touring U.S. bases, and then he will come to Washington, D.C. and have dialogues. I understand he's going to be going on there probably is some benefit. Of course, the Chinese use spy ships, so they observe U.S. exercises. There's a great deal they find out without actually going on the ships, and they don't see everything when they tour a ship. But I would also say that there's some deterrent value when the United States actually shows China the capabilities that we have. And we do hope, of course, that China will reciprocate more. And China sometimes shows a little bit of ankle, but it hasn't showed a great deal so far. We do hope that they will be more transparent in the future.
Good. Let's move on to Tsai Ing-Wen. Most accounts that I've read say that her trip was highly successful. Would you concur?
First, I think we have to start with what the benchmark is. What are we using to measure its success? And of course, most people are comparing this visit to the one that she made in 2011 before the elections in 2012 in Taiwan. That visit indeed did not go very well. And what happened after the visit was there was a report in the Financial Times that essentially was a statement by a U.S. official on background expressing concern and doubt that she could handle cross-strait relations and keep them stable. So coming into this visit, it was quite clear that neither Tsai Ing-Wen nor the United States government wanted to replay that visit of 2011. So in the run-up to this visit, there was a lot of communication between the U.S. and Taiwan, much of which was initiated by Tsai Ing-Wen and her staff. People who came to Washington, talked with U.S. officials, addressed their questions. There were papers that were released by the DPP on defense affairs, for example. There were discussions about trade issues, and there were discussions about what her cross-strait policy might look like. So when she arrived in Washington, there was a lot of groundwork that had already been done. In the course of the meetings that she had, I understand that she was willing to address questions that were posed to her, that there was a much deeper conversation than took place when she came here prior to the last election. So I don't think that this is the end of a process. We're in midstream. The process began before her visit. Her visit certainly built some more confidence, filled in some of the gaps in U.S. understanding. But as we go forward, there will be more questions, and there will be more dialogue. But right now, there is good communication between the United States and the DPP.
You know, it seems to me that the U.S. government has sort of accepted the fact that Tsai Ing-Wen is probably going to be elected president. Would you agree with that?
I don't think that the United States has drawn any conclusions about who will be elected in Taiwan. Regardless of who is president, the United States will want to have good communications with that individual and will want to promote the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. Nobody in the U.S. government, I think, is ruling out the possibility that a Kuomintang candidate can be elected. So far, the Kuomintang has not formally had its primary. It has not selected a candidate yet, and so it's just simply premature. But I assume that once there is a KMT candidate, that individual will also visit Washington and will have similar discussions with U.S. officials.
Interesting. Well, you said something very interesting, that questions will keep coming up. And I watched her speech at CSIS last week, took copious notes on it, by the way. And the way she handled questions about the status quo and the 92 consensus, and saying, well, you know, it's all in my speech, just go back and read my speech. That would seem to, you could probably say something like that to a fairly large public audience. But when she went into private sessions, I wonder if she was able to give such similar answers.
My understanding is no, she did not give those kinds of answers behind closed doors. But importantly, what she said in her speech, I think really needs to be read carefully, because she does talk in her speech about what she means by her objective of maintaining the status quo. So in discussions with U.S. officials, I think she went into greater detail, but the outlines of what she's talking about are there in her speech. And there are two elements that I think are very important. The first one is that she said that both sides of the strait should treasure and secure the accumulated outcomes of more than 20 years of negotiations and exchanges. That these accumulated outcomes will serve as the firm basis of her efforts to further the peaceful and stable development of cross-strait relations. Now, notice here, more than 20 years of accumulated outcomes includes the 1992 talks that took place 23 years ago. So Tsai Ing-Wen, in my interpretation, is not accepting the 1992 consensus, but she is saying that the talks that took place in 92 and the subsequent developments that took place under Lee Dong-hui, under Chen Shui-bian, and under Ma Ying-jeou are all part of the record of the accumulated outcomes of cross-strait relations, and that she will build on them. She will accept them. She will not repudiate what has taken place in the past. And she wants to continue to build that relationship. So I think that is close to saying that she will not reject the 1992 consensus, and that she understands that what happened in 1992, even if she doesn't think there was an agreement. But what happened was a belief on both sides that the cross-strait relationship had to move forward, and that she wants it to continue to move forward.
Great. We want to continue with this line of questioning, talking about the status quo, the 92 consensus, also talk about some of her challenges as she goes back to Taiwan. But we need to take another break right now, and we'll be right back. You're watching Asia in Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. My guest today is Bonnie Glaser, joining us from Washington, D.C. via Skype. Bonnie is a very highly regarded analyst of Chinese and Taiwanese affairs. Her publications have, her writing has appeared in a number of very prestigious publications, including Asian Survey. And we'll be right back.
This is Alice Lee Hagen, host of ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. My show here at ThinkTech Hawaii is every Thursday from 3 to 4 in the afternoon. I bring in interesting guests from Hawaii, the mainland, and hopefully international guests in the future. Do join us on Thursday from 3 to 4 p.m. ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. Aloha.
Aloha, my name is Paul Jackson, better known as PJ, and my local interest is in sports. I have my own sports radio show at KWAI AM 1080 that you can stream live. I also have my own website, pjsportsradio.com. We have live guests in studio, and we talk about discussions and topics that everyone wants to know locally here on the islands. We cover everything from surfing to basketball to whatever's going on locally, sports-wise. We try to do our best and cover the topics in depth as much as we can. Once again, thank you for joining PJ here on Hawaii Sports Update. Mahalo.
I would agree with that.
Welcome back to Asia in Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. We've been talking to Bonnie Glaser, and she's joining us via Skype from Washington, D.C. We talked about, in the first part of today's show, we talked about the Shangri-La dialogue, and then we moved on to talk about Tsai Ing-Wen's rather important visit to Washington, D.C. I wanted to let Bonnie finish giving an answer that she was sort of in the middle of when we had to take a break. And that was in response to a question on the status quo. So, Bonnie, it's all yours.
Thanks, Bill.
You're welcome.
So, just to complete my thought here, the other element that I thought was really interesting that Tsai Ing-Wen talked about when she discussed her definition of maintaining the status quo was her reference to the ROC constitutional order.
Oh, yeah, I remember that question came up in the Q&A. David Brown asked it, I think.
It was Professor David Brown from SAIS who asked her to elaborate on it, and she talked about the amendments to the Constitution and the court decisions. So let's not forget that she is a lawyer, and that she does understand very much the Constitution. And if you look at the ROC Constitution, and particularly the preamble, it defines what the ROC is and the geography of the ROC. So she was not very clear about this. And I don't know whether in her mind the constitutional order I assume it includes the preamble, but it might include later rulings, amendments, decisions that somehow in her mind have modified what the ROC is. So I'm not quite sure how to interpret this, and I think it requires more investigation. But I think it should be reassuring to the mainland that Tsai Ing-Wen has talked about these two things, the accumulated outcomes of more than 20 years and the ROC Constitution. I think this is Tsai Ing-Wen's effort to address what I think is Beijing's bottom line, and that is that she not pursue a two-states theory approach to the mainland, because, of course, she is seen as the creator of the two-states theory under Lee Teng-hui, and China's very concerned about that. And they're concerned also about a sort of one country on each side policy, which was pursued under Chen Shui-bian, and, of course, Tsai Ing-wen was head of the Mainland Affairs Council at that time.
That's a very, very good point. That's a very good point. You know, in a way, when I think about what she said and, you know, listening to some of what you said, been saying the last few minutes, in a sense, you know, it seems that a lot of what she said could fit into President Ma's rubric about don't fight, no, and no unification, no independence. I mean, that's all part of the status quo as well.
I agree, and I think that Tsai Ing-Wen might, I would hope that she would be able to say, certainly she can say no reunification, no use of force. Maybe she'll be able to say no de jure independence. There is a difference, of course, between no independence in the 1999 DPP resolution. It does state that Taiwan is an independent sovereign state. So I think that Tsai Ing-Wen might say that she would not seek de jure independence during her term in office. And that would be a welcome statement.
Let's talk about defense, because she made a couple points about defense in her speech. We want to be considered a reliable partner. We do not want the United States to feel that we're taking them for granted. We aspire to spend, to boost up the defense budget to 3% of GDP. All of this has got to be a welcome talk to the U.S. But I wonder how realistic it is, because certain folks other folks that I've talked to say, well, yeah, it's a nice idea, but we've got budgetary constraints, and it's going to be a little bit hard to get to. And I have this suspicion that since she has promoting a pretty vigorous domestic program, that she's probably going to want to spend money on domestic issues, and which in essence are vote buying issues. But what's your take on that?
Well, Taiwan's defense spending has not been 3% for 3% of GDP for a very long time. Chen Shui-bian had committed to raising it to 3% and didn't get that high, and then Ma Ying-jeou committed it to raising it to 3%. And now Taiwan's defense spending is under 2.2% of GDP. I think that there are several problems with that figure. One is certainly that Taiwan faces an enormous threat from the mainland and really does need to spend more on defense. But the second element, I think, is even more important, and that is that many people in the United States see this as an indicator of Taiwan's determination to defend itself.
Good point.
If Taiwan is not seen as determined to provide for its own self-defense, why should the United States plan to potentially, in a crisis, shed the blood of Americans to defend Taiwan? And so I think that it's very important for a government in Taiwan and the people in Taiwan to be demonstrating that they are committed to defend themselves. There are many ways to show that. Defense spending is one important one. Certainly exercises, preparations and procurements, there's a lot of ways. The fact that the government virtually never tells its people and talks about the military threat from China is also a problem, because the people of Taiwan seem to think that, peace has come, and very few people even accept those in the military.
That's a point of concern I share with you. I have that too, and that troubles me from time to time, because as you say, to expect Americans to come to Taiwan's aid and to spill American blood, if we want to put it that way, when we're not getting a sort of an equivalent effort from Taiwan, that's disturbing to me.
Yes, so I think that Tsai Ing-Wen, if she were elected president, will do some important things in the defense area, but that would be building on what has been done in the last few years, and we have seen some positive developments even as defense spending has reduced. We've seen some important procurements. There has been some progress towards indigenous weapons manufacture within Taiwan, and that's something that she's committed to develop further. And she has talked about boosting humanitarian assistance, disaster relief. She's talked about asymmetrical strategies. She understands that Taiwan needs to really build on its own advantages and focus on defending the homeland as opposed to any kind of power projection capabilities. I think there are areas where she understands that she would need to make some changes, but she would also build on some of what has already taken place. But frankly, I am also skeptical that Taiwan would get to 3% of GDP.
Well, we're coming down to our last 3 minutes. Let me be sure to get this question in. Is the United States in the midst of ramping up its relationship with Taiwan? I tell you why I suggest this. I have just very recently, we've seen where sister military commands have been created between Taiwan military commands and U.S. military commands. And again, just recently, Taiwan was invited to a leadership conference right here in Hawaii on amphibious landings. The Republic of China Chief of Naval Operations was invited to the change of command ceremony at Pekong. Senator McCain has introduced a bill to invite Taiwan to RIMPAC. Some statements by Assistant Secretary Russell and Deputy Assistant Secretary Susan Thornton have been, I think, probably very warmly welcomed in Taiwan. What's your take? Are we ramping up our relationship?
Well, I think that the U.S. and Taiwan, since Ma Ying-jeou came to power, have done a lot to strengthen the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. A lot has been done behind the scenes. And I think this list that you just gave represents greater willingness to make some of these things public. This is not the first time, for example, that we have conducted exercises with Taiwan or done training. It's not the first time that senior defense officials, officers from Taiwan have attended ceremonies or been to PACOM. And of course, Tsai Ing-Wen was welcomed into the State Department and the White House.
Right.
Is another example. I think there's more of a willingness on the part of the Obama administration to make some of these things public. But I don't think that it's really a very new trend. In the last 7 years, the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, I think, has become stronger in many areas.
Is any of this in response to what seems to be China's increasing belligerence in the South China Sea? And sort of, how should I put it this way? American salami slicing to counter Chinese salami slicing?
Well, I don't think that the U.S. relationship with Taiwan is in response to what China is doing in the South China Sea. I don't think we're trying to poke a finger in China's eye and say, if you behave badly over here, we're going to hurt your interest over there. I actually think that would be a pretty unwise strategy. What we're doing with Taiwan, I think, is really because it serves American interests, and it is in part in response to what continues to be a growing Chinese military threat to Taiwan.
Okay, well, I think we'll have to leave it here. We're ending right on time. Bonnie, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for, I know, possibly staying up late. There's 6 hours difference between Hawaii and the East Coast, and as always, you gave us a lot to think about, and I really appreciated you being on the show. Please join us next week when our guest will be Dr. Shelley Rigger, another very prominent voice dealing with Taiwan affairs. We'll see you then, and thank you very much for watching.